how can we look at prevention or earlier diagnosis without necessarily having to open up those birds? We have to remember when we're thinking about science, it's asking the questions, testing the hypotheses that are important, but the failures teach us as much as the successes.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this week's episode, we take a look at the pace of innovation in poultry health research using coccidiosis, a persistent and costly disease in poultry production, as our focus point. Joining us this week is Dr. Kayla Price from Alltech Canada. She joins us to explore whether academia and industry are aligned in tackling this long-standing challenge, if we're investing in the right ideas, and who's driving progress and what barriers might be slowing us down along the journey. She did her doctoral studies in poultry science at the University of Guelph, where she specialized in researching coccidiosis. At Alltech Canada, she bridges the research, technical support, and regulatory affairs functions of the company. She's a passionate advocate for animal agriculture and gut health in poultry specifically, and is featured as a regular speaker at national and international animal health and nutrition conferences, including our own Poultry Science Association annual meeting. Dr. Price, thanks for joining us on the podcast. I want to start from your perspective of the most persistent misconceptions, perhaps, about coccidiosis in both the academic and commercial settings. This is a challenge we talk about a lot. What do you see as the state of that conversation and any of the misconceptions that you see out there in the arena about this particular issue?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction here. I think one of the misconceptions when people start out with it is kind of having this idea that it's going to be an easy sell, so to speak. You have this parasite that works in this specific way with this specific life cycle. You can just kind of manage through that parasite and you'll be able to manage it on the other side. But when you start getting closer into it, whether you really know the parasite from an academic perspective, or you're on the other side from production and industry and you're trying to manage it at the farm level or the house level, then what seems like the simple life cycle becomes really complicated and it becomes complex because you have all of these other interactions that are happening all at the same time. And I think for myself, at least kind of coming out of my schooling and then coming into industry, that was, at least for me, one of my biggest misconceptions is thinking things were going to act in a specific way, but then realizing when you start getting into the field, there are so many other pieces that come into play. And I think that's something important really to keep in perspective for how you're thinking about it, either from that academic or research idea, just as much as the industry to the field, is there's much more at play than just the parasite itself.
You know, as you've been working on this from your time in grad school on now to many years in industry research, I'm curious how our understanding of the host parasite dynamics at play here have evolved in recent years, and maybe what implications that has for the control strategies we might employ. What do you think?
There is a lot that has been looked at and explored in terms of the microbiome or microbiota in general and its interaction with everything that's there, not just the bacteria, but also the parasites. There's viruses, everything that kind of comes into play. The more in-depth knowledge that we have right now of those interactions, or that one changing within, if you're running into some sort of coccidiosis challenge, whether clinical or subclinical, the impact this has on the bacteria that's there, or the other way, perhaps the impact that bacteria can have in terms of what's happening with the severity of coccidiosis, it's happening in the bird. And I think that's something that's certainly developed, and the collective we, both from the research perspective and what's happening in the field and commercialization, we've been able to look at that and say, okay, are there some ways that we could take advantage of so that we can work on helpful preventative strategies or control strategies, be able to manage pieces of this so that we can kind of look at gut health as a whole, which also includes coccidiosis as a part of that.
I want to start thinking about a little of the research at play here and maybe digging into some of the biology of the coccidia. I'm curious if there are any aspects of coccidia biology that you think are overlooked, or maybe aspects of host immunity that we've overlooked and you'd like to see get some more attention in the research.
I think we understand when we're thinking about Emeria as a parasite, it's incredibly species specific.
Mm.
So, in order to get the immunity for a particular Emeria species, it's going to be species specific to that particular Emeria, in addition to being very host specific. So, you have chicken Emeria, you have turkey Emeria, game bird Emeria, and so on. And within the academic field, we certainly understand those nuances, but the place to be able to look at and is still being looked at is, well, is there an ability perhaps to be able to come up with control strategies that can spread across these different Emeria species so that you're not just looking at one type of control strategy for a particular type of Emeria, but something that can encompass all of these different species, which is what's needed in the field. In terms of things that have been overlooked, I think it's not necessarily overlooked so much as we're working through what can be done now. And one of those interesting places are things like looking at the Emeria genome within research within the academic field that really started getting looked at since the early 2000s. The research community has been able to build on since then, but there's still much more to know. So it's not that it's been overlooked, it's more so trying to dig deeper into it. And then how can we use that to be able to help us in the field for what it is that we're doing to help with that control and that preventative management?
One of the things I've followed, I've been involved in covering all the animal health and the feed industries for, gosh, 20 plus years now. And so the consumer perspectives on how we raise birds have changed. The regulatory environment in which we raise birds has changed, and it always does, right? Evolution continues in both those arenas. I'm curious how the shifting environment there, consumer perspectives, regulatory environment, and so forth, access to technologies and whatnot, have shaped the questions we're asking in this research and the tools that we have available to control these parasites. And what are you seeing there? Or your thoughts on how all that's evolved in the time you've been working on this?
I think there's a couple things. In terms of the tools available, there's just so much more now. Just as we were talking about the genomics piece, that's something we didn't have before the 2000s, but it's something that's been built on since then. So we can look at that in terms of how can we build more on this to help us as a tool or to create more management tools. On the other side, from the diagnostics perspective. So, how can we start, but also continue to take advantage of artificial intelligence, as well as to some extent metagenomics to be able to look at enumeration or counting the parasites that could be in a single fecal sample, sort of looking at not just what parasites are there, but how many of those particular parasites are there, because it's never usually just one species, it's multiple. There's already some viability assays out there. So, are these parasites alive? Which is beneficial when you think about it in terms of the vaccine perspective, but also on the other side, if you're looking at fecal sample, are they actually going to reinfect the bird? So, how do we make these more user friendly, more point of care at the farm friendly so it could actually be used there? And I think that's building more and more now because of the tools, the technology that we have, whereas it may not really have been there in the past. So there's a lot more growth potential. And then you mentioned about from the regulatory perspective, there's other ways of how can we look at prevention or earlier diagnosis without necessarily having to open up those birds. So we can have our kilos of meat or our eggs at the end of the day. How can we make use of each bird? There's still certainly importance for opening up the bird and doing lesion scoring, but maybe there's other ways to be able to look at it that we didn't necessarily know before, but with some of these advancing technologies that are being built, there's more ways to look at prevention. And again, it's not to sort of take away the tried and true methods, but maybe there can be different ways of looking at things. That's always important to keep in mind.
In thinking about the relationship between the academic community and the industry when it comes to coccidiosis control, a lot of times when I'm observing discussions between industry and academia, you can intuit some communication gaps. Not always, but occasionally it happens. So I'm curious if in this arena you see any communication gaps between the academic research community and industry. And if there are those gaps, where do you see the big ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's thinking about how we're thinking of gaps. You have different groups that may speak slightly different languages, so to speak. And to be honest, it can be both in the academic community, but you also have basic research or true bench work happening in the industry community as well for
Sure.
commercialization. And you have those that are thinking about the true basic science of it. What can be done from that perspective? What are those different molecular pieces that we can look at that maybe we can take advantage of? And they'll have one perspective, their direction, and what they're looking for. And then you have the other side, which is the practical in the field. I need to make this work because 18 other things are happening today and I don't understand why you're just working in this small space, more toward the folks that are focusing versus folks that are perhaps a bit more generalist. And I think both are very important pieces to chase and to look at, both that focused, very detailed bench work or basic science on how you can look at the coccidiosis as a disease prevention control, just as much as I need to look at this method and how it's actually going to work in my industry practice, the farm integration, kind of mixing up my Canadian terminology, my US terminology, and some of the internationals in there too. And that's where I see, I get the biggest spread is sometimes you have these two different views that are not necessarily intentionally talking to each other and understanding each other's perspective. Both are very important, both are very valid. But if we had more communication of why we're looking at this or why we need it to work this way in the field,
Mm.
maybe both of those together can really help to build something better at the end of the day. It may not be that flashy innovation that we think of, but it's still innovation and it's still important.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, Dr. Price. Thinking about how we collaborate and move this forward, are there models from other areas of disease research that you think we could borrow to better improve collaboration, data sharing, and innovation?
I mean, I think it happens within coccidiosis research itself. I think of myself and I'm going through my PhD, and I certainly worked with companies that were invested in coccidiosis as a part of the products that they had and how we can make that practically work from a farm perspective and still looking at the research of it for those parasite dynamics and how different birds can pick up the Imuria, what gets shed out the back end. And I think there's a lot of examples of that actually happening in coccidiosis research, just as much as we'd have other fields, for example, like necrotic enteritis is another one where you have this collaboration. So there are many different examples that are out there. I think it's just we need to continue to have more of it, especially with the new diagnostic tools coming out, even new prevention products, new ideas. It's not just the product itself, but also what are the best uses, the best doses, how can you optimize what's going to be practical in the field. So the more conversations that we can have, I think the better. And another piece is also the more conversations that we can have early as we're building the ideas or building the hypothesis or how we're going to test it, bringing in people that are going to be dealing with it in the field also gives perspective that's important, or vice versa from the field perspective, understanding what could be done from a research perspective or some of the new things that are being looked at could help to inform, okay, maybe this is what we can work towards. And having those come together, right? The model is there. It's just how we do more of it.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. And thinking now about the research process and specific projects, one of the challenges for any researcher, of course, is funding. What kind of research projects around coccidiosis do you see as maybe important but hardest to get funded? And do you have any advice on, how researchers might address that particular challenge?
When you're thinking about funding, whether you're looking at grants or if you're looking to industry to be able to get funding for particular projects, each group has their specific goals in mind. Sometimes the goals are outlined if you look at what the application is. Sometimes you have a better understanding of what the goals are when you have a conversation with the person who could be potentially providing that funding. And even though you may have a very specific and targeted question, you have to be able to understand what the goals are of those providing that funding are. And maybe thinking about how that question could be adjusted to be able to help them achieve those goals. And it's not that you're not going to ask that question anymore, but maybe you ask it or you frame it in a slightly different way so that now you, as the researcher, you're able to achieve what it is that you want to achieve in terms of your questions. But at the same time, you're also able to help those that are providing the funding achieve their goals so that both of you can essentially get what you want. It's working to a positive compromise. And I think being able to better understand that becomes really helpful to ultimately gain the funding that you're wanting. And in some cases, you may run into a situation where you may not necessarily get the funding that you're expecting. But at that point, it's okay, trying to understand and learn from that. How can things be readjusted or maybe applied to a different place to be able to help you gain that funding so you can work on what you're interested in, but also helps to better the field in general?
I'm thinking about then on the back end of this, let's say you've gotten it funded and you've had a great project, and then of course we need to get it published, and that's certainly a big part of our mission at PSA is publishing the leading journals in poultry science. But I'm curious if you see the publishing landscape generally today friendly or workable for the kind of interdisciplinary work you've talked about that we need to make breakthroughs in managing a complex challenge like coccidiosis.
I think there's a lot of journals that are out there that are great journals to go into. I'm certainly biased to Poultry Science and Journal of Applied Poultry Research, but at the same time, there's many that are out there, and even like avian disease and others. And again, it's kind of going back to your funding question. For those journals, they have a particular style, a particular audience, reason why they're publishing what they're publishing. And each of those journals has their particular goals. So if you're thinking about, okay, well, where can I publish this paper? How can I make sure that it gets accepted and all of that? Again, it's thinking about that it's actually reading the author guidelines and following them in how you're going to write that paper. Again, it's not changing your research project or changing your question. It's adapting to the guidelines that are being provided and making sure that you're adapting to the audience that you're writing to. And that's incredibly important. It's important for the audience to want to read your work, to be interested in your work. And it's also just important for getting your work accepted as well, just from a reviewer perspective.
Well, you've just earned your way on the Christmas card lists of Mike Kogut and Brian Fairchild and Barbara Chenka at our journals, because the number of times in our journal meetings that they lament the authors who don't read the guide to authors who follow the instructions, it's more common than you would like to admit. So kudos to you for calling out one of the most important things an author can do. If you are listening to this and publishing, read and follow the instructions to authors. It really does make a difference. And yeah, your point though makes a difference in the quality of the writing, frankly, right? If the journal article is presented properly for the format and the audience in which you're trying to publish, it improves the quality of the scholarship.
Absolutely. I think the other piece too, it's a delicate balance, but it's incredibly important. And it's something I personally always stress. We talk about telling the story within Alltech. It's incredibly important in scientific research. The reader needs to understand the why,
Mm.
the process, but also how it's going to apply. Even if it's very basic work, and I'm saying basic as in it's not ready for commercialization, you still have many steps prior to commercialization. But if the reader doesn't understand the why or how it can be applied eventually, then you don't necessarily have the connection as a reader with that work. And that piece is also incredibly important to get people to follow along and then want to hear more of what it is that you have. And it's telling that story of the whole piece, regardless of where you are in the spectrum of your research.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. Dr. Price, as we get down to the short rows here and start to wind up our conversation together, I always like to ask the crystal ball question of my guests. Looking ahead, what are some emerging technologies, whether we're talking about generative AI, whether we're talking about microbiome engineering? You talked earlier about some of the genomics advances that we've made in the last 20 years, precision farming and nutrition, the whole grab basket of technologies that are emerging today. If you think out 5, 10 years down the line, which of those, or maybe ones that I'm not even thinking of, do you think could really redefine or meaningfully advance how we approach coccidiosis and control of this important management challenge?
Can my final answer just be all of the things?
Well, I mean, that's the question, right? Like, is how do we use them? They're coming. So, what's your crystal ball? Tell me what you see.
Oh, I don't know. My crystal ball's a little broken, but I think honestly, there's just so much. And like, there's just so much that's built even from my time going through school, my time in industry, and I'm sure there's so much more to come. The easy thing to say that's interesting is what is happening with artificial intelligence. I think it's our big buzzword and how we can use it as a tool right now. I don't necessarily think it's a replacement, but we have to use it as a tool to help preventative identification, thinking about things from the manure or the fecal droppings. How could we look at that and get some ideas out there? There's some interesting things that have been worked on and are continuing to be worked on from that perspective. Again, you can think about it in terms of what's helping for not just looking at the number of parasites or what Chimeria species are there, but also the number. That'll be a huge helpful tool and easier, faster ways of doing that. But at the same time, you have the other side, which is what are the different strategies for both prevention, control, management if you're thinking about new products coming into the market, new combinations of products, but also optimizing doses, how you can use those pieces that may already be on the market, but maybe there's better ways of using it, other levels. So I think there's more to continue and probably even more that I'm not even thinking of that's either out there or will be out there. I think there's a lot of opportunity, which is incredibly exciting, and a lot of questions to be asked and answered. And that is really what gets me going, the questions to be asked, but also the questions to be answered, and how we can work together to make it practical so it's usable and it helps to really advance us collectively. And that's the most exciting part for me.
One of my favorite things about interviewing scientists and researchers is the search continues. That optimism that comes with curiosity. There are always more questions to ask, rabbit holes to go down, advancements. You embody that so well. I love that part of your personality that really comes through loud and clear, and you talk about the future. We'll give you one last question here. It's a good one to maybe scratch that same kind of itch. What would it take to build a more resilient pipeline of innovation? So you work at a company that is grounded in innovation and telling that story of innovation. What do you see that it would take to build a more resilient pipeline of innovation from the lab, the bench, on through to the broiler house? Maybe specifically at coccidiosis, but even more generally, where do you see the opportunities to improve the throughput there from the bench and that basic research that we were talking about earlier on through to the practical application in the house with the birds?
That's a really good question. And I'm thinking about what are some of the lessons I've personally learned through that. And I think I've definitely said this before as we're chatting along here. It's pieces of how we can listen to each other and then also have those casual questions of, hey, do you think this is going to work? What do you think? Being open to different perspective, but also being open to someone kind of playing the villain, so to speak. You can have the best, most optimistic, this is going to be the greatest thing ever. But you also have to listen to some of those pieces of saying, well, maybe if you thought about readjusting this, or that's great as an idea, but really when we deal with this in the field, that's not going to happen because of this. And it's not that someone's necessarily putting your idea down, but sort of just pointing out little things that if you thought through it, it would help to make it better. And I think it's also important, especially in coccidiosis, it's something that's been researched for a long time. We have to appreciate what has been done and look at what has been done but also be bold enough to be able to introduce newer, different ideas and get those perspectives on it. And I think a piece I definitely learned while going through school, but I've certainly learned a lot more while being in the industry is we have to remember when we're thinking about science, it's asking the questions, testing the hypotheses that are important, but the failures teach us as much as the successes. And we need to be open to that. And the more we can be open to it, the more we're going to learn and the more we're going to collectively improve.
Yeah, well said. Negative result's still a result, and it advances the understanding. I love that. Great balanced perspective. Dr. Kayla Price with Alltech and one of the leaders in Canada in their operation there, but as I say, also a national and internationally recognized leader in this effort. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Price, and for a great conversation. Friends, thank you for being a part of this conversation and for listening each week here to this podcast. If you haven't done so already, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Give us a rating. It helps other folks in the community find the podcast if they're searching and haven't yet discovered us. If your particular podcast platform has the little notification dealio, please add that as well so you don't miss us. We're here each week at the same bat time, same bat channel. All right, we are just under 4 weeks away from the inaugural PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference in Macau, the Special Administrative Region of China. It's a beautiful city. I'm looking forward to being back there at the Londoner Grand here in early October. You still have time to register if you haven't done so already. The scientific program is available online, and if it is not already there, it will be shortly. The program app so you can go through and network with other attendees, and also, of course, download the program and plan out your schedule, what abstracts you want to take part in, symposia you want to sit in on. Full slate of activities at the PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference coming up just under 4 weeks from today. Join us there. You can register and find all of the scientific materials at poultryscience.org. You'll see the Pacific Rim meeting right there on the front page. All right, friends, until next week, for the Poultry Science Association and Unplucked, I'm Andy Vance.